Welcome to Internet Applications. What we're going to be doing over the course of this module is looking at writing Internet applications using Java Servlets and Java Server Pages. So what we're going to start off with is an introduction to Java Servlets, and over the next few lectures we'll look at those in some detail. And then we'll move on to look at Java Server Pages, and after that a few other things that surround it, things like architectures and patterns. And so today what we're going to look at are some architectural components, the kinds of requests that we might deal with, and then see a couple of examples. So a couple of things that we're not going to talk about in this lecture. We're not going to talk about HTML because we assume that you know something about that already. You don't need anything very clever in terms of HTML for this module, and we'll talk about some of the concepts as we go. If you're not very confident with HTML, then there's a couple of resources here that you might consider reading as part of your exploring the subject matter. As a slight aside, what we present in the lectures is really only the minimum level of attainment. And what you need to do is use as much time as you can to read around the subject. Every module has around about 150 hours of learning time. But of course you're in class for only a very small proportion of that. 4 hours in each week. Actually only 3 hours in each week, isn't it? And that leaves you, therefore, quite a lot of time outside of class, which equates to about 10 hours per week outside of class. And so you should use that time to complete the tutorial work and also to read around the subject. So, for example, if you don't know very much about HTML, use some of that 10 hours to go and learn something about HTML. Likewise with cascading style sheets, CSS, we assume that you already know CSS. If you don't, then go and learn something about it. Again, you won't need anything very sophisticated for this module. Now we could write HTML files, no problem. But the problem with HTML files is that they are static. Once you've written the HTML file and saved it on the web server, your users can all go and view that file, but it will seem to be exactly the same for every single user. And it will stay in exactly the same state until the next time you edit and save it. And therefore, it's quite possible that you'll find HTML pages that are 10 years old and haven't changed in 10 years. Not only that, but it prevents us providing a customized application for our users. So we don't really want to use HTML in its normal static state. What we want instead is to have something that is dynamically generated. And we can dynamically generate HTML in all kinds of ways. On this module we shall use servlets and then later on Java Server Pages to dynamically generate HTML. When we say dynamically, what we mean is the HTML is constructed at the time of execution and then is written back to the web browser for the client to see. The web browser does not know whether the HTML came from a static HTML file or from, let's say, a Java servlet. As far as the web browser is concerned, it asked for a file and it got HTML back in reply. And so it's quite happy and will display whatever it gets. Now, when a web browser makes a request for a servlet, all kinds of things happen. First of all, the web browser has to display a link that the user can click on. When the user clicks that link, the browser will then send an HTTP request of some sort, and I'll talk about those requests in a few moments. When the request arrives at the web server, it will take the request, decode it, work out what's been asked for, and then will search to see if it has what has been requested. And if the server can find what has been requested, it will then process that request, writing back the HTML that has been requested. And then the web browser will take this dynamically generated HTML and display it for the user to see. And so that gives us three main components in our architecture: the web server, the servlet that executes on the server, and the web browser that executes typically on the client PC, which could be absolutely anywhere in the world, of course. You're very familiar with using web browsers, and when you make a request, you could sit at home in whatever country that might be and make a request that's halfway around the world. The server could be halfway around the world. And with the speed of light, and perhaps a little bit slower because of the network in between, you eventually get a response that comes back. Now, the communication between the web browser and the web server typically will be using the Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP. And this is an industry standard protocol that means that the server and the client, which is the web browser, can talk according to a set of rules. They have a defined sequence of communication. And that's the protocol. And by using that protocol for our communications, we're able to have easy access to servers, and firewalls typically will allow HTTP communication without any great difficulty. The web server holds the servlet, and when the request comes in from the web browser, it will trigger the execution of that servlet. And the servlet then, which is a Java program, will execute and generate the HTML to send back to the web browser. So the browser makes an HTTP request for a servlet. The server looks for that requested servlet. If it doesn't find it, what the server does is write back an error message. And if the servlet does exist, then it gets executed. And that's what makes this a dynamic process, because the execution of the servlet will dynamically generate some output that it then goes back to the web browser. And by clicking here, we should get to see a demonstration of this process. This is an applet, which is another kind of Java program. It runs in the context of a web page. So this is demonstrating a GET request. There are two kinds of requests. I'll talk more about those in a minute. And here we have the web browser, the web server, and the servlet that is associated with that web server. So those are the three major components. The browser sends an HTTP GET request to the server. The server locates the servlet, which generates the HTML dynamically and sends it back to the browser, and the browser displays it. Okay, so we've got this round trip that takes place. This is not unique to Java systems, of course. That is the HTTP round trip. So you could do that kind of thing in any kind of language that would allow you to send HTTP requests to to servers. So, for example, Perl, which is a programming language that can do this kind of thing. All kinds of other programming languages will let you do that. Some of them will wait for the request to come in, then load the requested resource, execute it, and unload it. And of course that loading and unloading has an overhead that can increase the delay between the request being sent by the browser and the response coming back. Now with Java, what happens with the servlets is that the very first request for a servlet will cause the servlet to be loaded, but then it will stay memory resident. unless the server runs out of memory and needs to unload it for some reason. But generally, that servlet will stay in the server's memory, ready to run immediately the next request comes in. So the second request won't have this extra delay of having to wait for the servlet to be loaded again. So that makes it quite an efficient and quite a quick process. As I mentioned just now, sometimes a servlet could be unloaded, and the server will have some strategy for deciding exactly which servlet to unload, and typically it will look for the servlet that hasn't been used very recently. So the oldest servlet, that is the one that's had the request the furthest time ago, the longest time ago, that's most likely to be the one unloaded. So let's get down to some code. This is a programming module, and so we need to get to grips with the code. This is the basic structure of a servlet. We'll ignore the first 3 lines for now and go straight to line 5. When we're defining our Java class, we'll do it as an ordinary Java class, public class, and then some name. You give it whatever name you want. And then we make it a subclass by using the extends keyword. So we make it a subclass of HTTP servlet. This is a class that is in the javax.servlet.http package, and therefore we need to do this import on line 3. As soon as we've written those 2 words, extends HTTP servlet, we have made this class a servlet class, and through the rules of inheritance we have immediately inherited all those methods that are necessary to make this servlet work on the server. You see, on the server there is what's called a servlet container, and that is essentially another program that runs and knows how to talk to servlets. So if we make our class a servlet and drop that into the servlet container, it will already have all the necessary methods for the container and our new servlet to talk to each other. And what we have to do then is to override those inherited methods that we're interested in. One of the inherited methods is the doGet method, which we can see on lines 15 to 19. When an HTTP GET request is received by the server, and it finds that the servlet is present, then the servlet container will call the doGet method. If, on the other hand, the HTTP request is a POST request, then the servlet container will call the doPost method. So it depends on what kind of request comes in as to which one of those 2 methods will be called. Typically, we'll want to do exactly the same kind of processing whichever type of request we've received. And so normally, and you'll find this with NetBeans, normally what we would do is to create our own method, something like process request, and then in doGet and in doPost we'll just call that method process request. And that way we're only writing once the code to process the request. There are other what we call lifecycle methods, such as destroy. We might talk about those in another lecture at some point. So really the only things we're really interested in are the doPost and doGet at this point. So what we're going to do is look at an example of a GET request. Now when we have a GET request, there are certain things involved. Remember I said right at the beginning that we need to provide a link for the user to click to send the request for that servlet. And that link has got to be part of an HTML display. So we will have an HTML file. That HTML file might just have a link, a hyperlink that will have the servlet's address, or we might have an HTML form which, when submitted, will then send in the data that's associated with that form. Just using a hyperlink on its own means that we can't really send in any data. It's just a link. So if we have any data to send in, it might be, for example, the username and password, or it might be address and date of birth and things like that, then we would need to put that inside an HTML form. And what you can see on screen here is an example of an HTML form. We're guaranteeing that the request made is an HTTP GET request because we got the attribute method equals GET. And the other attribute here on this form tag is action. And we make that equal to the URL of the servlet that we want to execute. Now, in this very simple example, what we've got is a little paragraph stating or telling the user what they need to do. So just single click the button. And then we have an input tag which gives us or tells us that this is a submit type, and that means it's going to be a button. And the value, which is the text that is going to be displayed on the face of the button, is click here. And so when that button is displayed on the web browser screen, by clicking on there, it will send an HTTP GET request to the nominated servlet. So that provides the functionality for the user to request the servlet to execute. One of the things I want to point out here or re-emphasize is the fact that what we're putting here is not the name of the servlet class. We're using the URL of the servlet, and that's quite an important concept, and we'll come back to that. By some mechanism that we'll discuss another time, the URL of the servlet, which is sent to the server, is decoded so that the server then works out exactly which servlet class to execute. And in our example, the servlet class that we're going to execute is this one here, the doGet servlet. It extends HTTP servlet as we had before. We've got a private method here that is called getTime and returns a string. And the way that it works on line 9 is to get from the system the current time as a number of milliseconds. The way this works is that every date is calculated as a number of milliseconds since midnight on the 1st of January 1970. So 1 millisecond after midnight on that day has the value 1. 2 milliseconds has got the value 2. 1 second after midnight has got the value 1000. 1 minute after midnight has got the value 60,000, and so on. So now, a few decades later, you can imagine that that number, that integer, is now very, very big. And so we can't store that value in an integer. We need to use the data type long, which is essentially a very big integer. It's got lots of space. And what we're doing next in lines 10, 11, and 12 is extracting from that very big number of milliseconds since midnight on the 1st of January 1970, the number of seconds today, that is the number of seconds of the current minute, then the number of minutes in the current hour, and then the number of hours in the current day, so that we get today's current time as hours, minutes, and seconds. And we format this, there we are, the variables, HH, hours, MM, minutes, SS, seconds, separated by colons, but we want to make sure that there are 2 digits for each number. And so we test. If HH is less than 10, then we need to have a 0. Otherwise, we don't need anything. And then the value of hours. So let's say hours was 8. Then this would say, true, hours is less than 10. So we're going to put into the string a 0, 8. On the other hand, if hours is 11, this is going to be false. And so we'll output nothing followed by 11. So there's always going to be 2 digits for the hours, 2 digits for the minutes, 2 digits for the seconds, separated by colons, returned as a string to whoever calls this method. Well, let's look at the doGet method for this servlet. A couple of things that we need to note about doGet, and indeed this is true of doPost. There are 2 parameters, the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. These 2 objects are given to the servlet by the Servlet Container. So the Servlet Container will take that HTTP request that came from the client, the web browser, and will decode it into its individual bits and pieces, and then will construct one of these HTTP servlet request objects, putting all the putting into the object all the information that it has about that request that came from the web browser. Likewise for the response object, and then both the request object and the response object are sent as parameters to this method when it's called. So that by the time we start executing, we have got available all the request information and the response information that we need. So on line 23, for example, we can declare this variable of type printWriter, which will allow us to write text, and we make it equal to the responses output stream. That's what getWriter gives us. So essentially, we have now got a direct link back to the web browser. And any text that we write using that variable will go back to the web browser. So we've now got a channel open so that whatever our program outputs will be sent to the web browser and the web browser can use it. Because the web browser is going to be operating on HTML, we're going to send it some information. For example, the result object .setContentType allows us then to say this is HTML in the form of text. And then we need to send it some text. Because it's expecting HTML, we need to make sure that our text is properly formatted HTML. And so you get, for example, on line 25, the HTML tag, and then a new line, and then the head tag, and then a title tag, and then the end title, end head, then the body tag with a background color, and so on. Now you'll notice with this one on line 29 that what we want to do is to have a double quote embedded within our string. And to achieve that, what we have to do is to use the backslash in front of that embedded double quote. And that will then interpret this double quote as part of the string rather than as the end of the string that was started here. And that makes it a little bit awkward, and it's going to be awkward every time we talk about this with servlets, but when we get onto Java server pages, we'll resolve that awkwardness. So the way we send these messages, having set up the output variable on line 23, we're then able to do things like output.println. Now, if you've written any Java programs before, then you're familiar with using system.out.print, system.out.println, system.out.printf. And you can use those same methods with output, this printWriter. So if you know how to send messages using system.out, then you know how to use printwriter too, because it's exactly the same. So what we're doing is sending out lots of messages containing HTML text. And right down here on line 35, we're embedding a method call to the method that we were looking at just a few moments ago on the previous screen, the getTime method, that is going to get the current time and construct a string that shows the current time. So that comes back here as a string, which is then catenated to the other part of the message. And so what will be output on the web browser is the current time right now. Then when the request is refreshed, you get the current time right then. And then again and again. And so it will illustrate very nicely the dynamic nature of the servlet, because every time the servlet executes, it gets a fresh value, and that fresh value is sent back to the web browser. Now, the other type of HTTP request is the POST request. And this differs in basically two fundamental ways. When you're using a GET request, the parameters of that request are displayed as part of the what's called the query string. And you see that in the address bar on the web browser. When you use a POST request, it doesn't work like that. All you get to see on the address bar of the web browser is the servlet URL that you requested. All the data that goes with it is sent as a separate posting, a separate package of data. So that's the first difference. The other difference is when you're using a GET request, because all the data goes in one string that's sent off to the web server, there's a limit to how much data you can send. When you're using a POST request, because it's sent as separate packages of data, there is no limit to the amount of information that can be sent on the request. So those are the two major differences. Now with this example, to make our request a POST request, it's as simple as changing method equals get to method equals post. We have to put in the URL of the servlet. And again, I emphasize it's the URL of the servlet, not the servlet class name. And I'll talk on another occasion about how the container decodes that URL and works out which actual class is to be executed. Now with this example, we've got an extra input, which is your name. There's the text that tells the user what's to be input. And then here the input has a type equal to text, so it's going to be a text box. And the name of this text box is, perhaps I could have chosen a slightly better label for this, but it's called name with a capital N. So when this form is submitted, whatever the user has typed in the text box will be sent as a parameter on the request. The name of the parameter is name with a capital N, and the value of the parameter will be whatever the user has typed. And that form will only be submitted when the user clicks on that submit button. Again, the web server will determine what kind of request has come in. It will then gather all the information, including all that parameter data, whatever the user typed, and will bundle it up into the request and response objects that are then sent as parameters. In this case, to the doPost method, because it's a post request. What we're doing here on line 23 is getting hold of the value of the parameter called name with a capital N. In other words, whatever the user typed in that text box will be the value of the parameter, and by calling from the request object the getParameter method, specifying that we want it to be the name parameter with a capital N, That value typed by the user will then be returned as a string which we can store in our variable. So once line 23 is executed, whatever the user has typed is now stored in that variable name. Now the thing I have to point out here is the name that we put here has got to have exactly the same spelling with exactly the same mix of uppercase and lowercase letters as was defined back here in the HTML. So if I were to define the name of that text box as XYZ with a capital Z, then in the servlet, when I get the parameter, I will have to put in here XYZ with a capital Z. And one of the downfalls, one of the early mistakes that students will make on this module is to forget to make sure that the spelling on line 23 here and here in the form, they forget to make sure that the spelling is exactly the same. So watch out for that little pitfall. We then are testing to see if the name is null, because if nothing has been typed, you might get a null come back. If that's the case, we'll set the variable name to an empty string, otherwise we'll make it equal to itself. That's just like saying if name is equal to null, then make name equal to the empty string, double quote, double quote. Then we just process as normal. We're setting up the output back to the web browser, and then we're using println to send HTML tags. And with this one, we're customizing it, so we're making this a custom response for our user, and we're testing the value of name. If it equals the empty string, then we're going to put on the string unknown person. Otherwise, whatever the user typed, which is now stored in the variable name, is going to be catenated to what comes before. So we'll either have hello unknown person, if the user typed nothing, or we'll have hello followed by whatever the user typed. So we've now seen that it's quite easy to get hold of the information that's typed on an HTML form by the user. And our servlets can get hold of that data very easily and then process it. In this example, all we're doing is just sending back or echoing back whatever they typed. But of course, we could use that in all kinds of ways. We could store it in a database, for example, and then retrieve it at some other time. That's as much as I'm going to say today, and we'll look at more complicated things next time.